In this video, we'll be looking at the concept of constant fuel economy when driving a truck. If you have ever driven on an interstate highway, you have probably seen semi-tractor trailers. Instead of maintaining a constant speed, these large trucks tend to drive slowly uphill and then speed up when they go downhill. The reason they do this is to balance driving speed with fuel efficiency. In this video, we'll look at the fuel efficiency of these trucks. We're going to consider a semi driving on a highway as it goes up and down hills. Going uphill uses more fuel to maintain a particular speed, and going downhill uses less fuel to maintain that speed. So, the semi changes its speed to maintain a constant fuel efficiency. Watch the truck moving along the road, and think about the fuel efficiency of the truck as it drives. There are several measurable attributes of the truck's trip which we might be interested in. One of them is the amount of fuel the truck has consumed, measured in gallons. I'll show the truck's motion again and use a purple bar to represent the fuel consumption. Specifically, the length of the bar will represent the amount of gallons that have been consumed since the truck started driving on the highway. Another measurable attribute of the truck's trip is the distance it has traveled. I'll show the truck's motion again, this time also adding a blue arrow to illustrate the distance the truck has traveled since it started driving on the highway. As you watch, think about how the amount of distance the truck has traveled, the length of the blue arrow, is growing in comparison to the amount of fuel it has used, the length of the purple rectangle. In order to compare how the amount of distance traveled and the amount of fuel consumed were growing, we can measure each of these quantities. I'll show how the amount of fuel consumed increases again, and mark off 1/10 of a gallon intervals to measure this amount. So there were 5 1/10 gallon intervals. Next, I'll measure the amount of distance the truck has traveled since starting to drive on the highway. This time, I'll use arrows to show the amount of distance the truck travels for each 1/10 of a gallon of fuel it uses. Each fuel consumption interval has an amount of change in gallons, in this case 1/10 of a gallon. Also, each distance interval has an amount of change in distance, in this case 3.4 miles. Now let's think about how these fuel consumption intervals correspond to the distance intervals. These black lines indicate how each distance interval corresponds to a fuel consumption interval. The key feature here is that the distance traveled in each interval, represented by the length of each arrow, is always the same, no matter which 1/10 of a gallon fuel consumption interval you are looking at. What would happen if we used 1/20th of a gallon intervals instead of 1/10 of a gallon intervals? I'll show the truck's trip again, this time splitting it into 1/20th of a gallon intervals. Each fuel interval has an amount of change in fuel, in this case 1/20th of a gallon. Also, each distance interval has an amount of change in distance, in this case 1.7 miles. Now let's think about how these time intervals correspond to the distance intervals. As before, these black lines indicate how each distance interval corresponds to a fuel interval. The key feature here is that the size of each distance interval is always the same, no matter which 1/20th of a gallon fuel interval you are looking at. Now, we've seen two examples where the size of each distance interval is always the same for each fuel interval. Another way to say this is for any fixed amount of change in gallons, the corresponding change in distance is constant. In this case, for every 1/10 of a gallon of fuel consumed, there is a 3.4-mile change in distance. This means that for any 1/10 of a gallon of fuel consumed, the truck will travel 3.4 miles. So, the truck consumes fuel at a constant rate of 3.4 miles per 1/10 of a gallon. And this is what it means for the truck to be getting a constant fuel efficiency. Another important aspect of constant fuel efficiency is knowing the truck travels 3.4 miles for every 1/10 of a gallon allows us to know the truck's fuel efficiency over any other amount of fuel consumed. For example, if the truck travels 3.4 miles for every 1/10 of a gallon, the truck must travel 1.7 miles for every 20th of a gallon of fuel it uses. Or 6.8 miles for every 2/10 of a gallon. So in this case, another way to describe what it means for the truck to have a constant fuel efficiency of 3.4 miles per 1/10 of a gallon is that the truck's change in distance in miles is 34 times as large as the corresponding change in the amount of fuel consumed in gallons.